is the form. And our second will tell you why it is more plausible. Our first substantive is that preventing nuclearization is the most important goal for America and the global community at large. One, recognize that this is a normative debate about what is best for society. We firstly think that it is principally necessary to prioritize preventing nuclearization because of the magnitude of the threat. One, nuclear weapons, if used or accidentally deployed, as has happened in the past, threaten to kill millions of lives, cause health issues and developmental problems for millions of others, etc. This is very harmful for human life and inconsistent with any moral framework that values human life, whether Kantian or consequentialist. Two, nuclear weapons are also incredibly harmful for the environment. Even their development requires harmful mining, waste dump, etc. And their usage is even more dangerous as places we saw it like Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Second, we want to prove to you why Iranian nuclearization is a uniquely huge probable threat. One, Iranian nuclear weapons threaten global stability by increasing the likelihood of nuclear conflict. It's particularly dangerous because terrorist groups have a history of attempting and nearly succeeding in accessing nuclear weapons. This happened in South Africa in the 90s back when they had a nuclear arsenal. Two, the risk of miscalculation is high because many countries, including Iran, North Korea, are secretive about where they are at with nuclearization, which means that it is hard for other countries to create preventative measures. One, we've already seen how miscalculations bring the world to the edge of nuclear conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where other countries can't engage each other. And two, that when one country threatens to nuclearize, other countries within the surrounding region, likely fearing for their own domestic security, are also more likely to nuclearize, thus increasing tensions across the world, especially in the Middle East. And three, even if there's no miscommunication or malintent, there's still a high likelihood of nuclear accidents. They have happened in the past with accidental deployments, leaks, etc. Given that all of this is true, from the environmental impacts that come with developing nuclear weapons to the greater probability of nuclear war and rising nuclear tensions within the Middle Eastern region to the possibility of actual nuclear deployment, we see a principled and practical obligation for America to prioritize preventing nuclearization when it comes to Iranian foreign policy. Our second substantive is that it is more plausible to prevent nuclearization than reduce the influences of armed militias. First, armed militias do not solely subsist on Iranian state funding. They are funded by other states, geopolitical forces such as covert funding from China or Russia, and have taken over in some cases local resources such as oil fields. Such it is likely that these armed militias could survive even if Iran did not fund them. Government has a huge burden in this round. They have to prove that first, Iran will listen to America and actually scale back funding, and second, that this will actually make any difference in their respective conflicts. For example, Hezbollah has also gotten funding from Syria, and these groups also get some forms of grassroots funding. Given the larger profit backing that we tell you, the second burden can never be fulfilled. Second, it is hard to monitor whether Iran will implicitly fund these groups, even if they strike a formal deal with the United States to withdraw support. On the comparative, monitoring nuclear sites is easier for two reasons. America's existing drone technology. OG literally concedes that US monitoring has found nukes in the past, which means that we can use the monitoring technology to hold them accountable. They themselves give us the mechanism there. Two, there's a system of checks and balances that we have built throughout the years of the Iran nuclear deal. Three, we have a better understanding of where nuclear development could occur, given just the magnitude of these sites and the resource extraction, and who are the primary actors, given Iran's limited human capital resources, as versus militias, which are designed to be extremely mobile physically, adept at changing bases, as well as having flexible leadership structures. OG argues that Iran is trying to seem more humanitarian publicly, and thus to gain more soft diplomatic power. And thus publicly, it is likely that they may agree to no longer prioritize supporting armed militias. But considering that Iran prioritizes the power of the states ultimately, and that supporting these militias has historically perpetuated its state's power, it's more likely that it'll just secretly fund or covertly fund through other entities these kinds of armed militias. It's incredibly hard to track these kinds of supply chains, especially when we don't have boots on the ground, which is something that would be massively unpopular politically, as we're literally trying to withdraw troops from the Middle East. That has been going on for 10 years. Before I move on, I will take a POI from closing. I'll take a POI from opening.
Why would Iran back out of these deals and go behind the US's back if it knows that very harsh sanctions are coming its way if it gets found out?
Okay, this is the thing. It's very unlikely it would be found out because there's a lot of covert funding resources. You can fund it through smaller funds, smaller banks, individual actors. It's just incredibly likely, given the characterization I've given you of Iran's motives, that it'll just happen covertly, and it's unlikely that America will be able to find out. Also, it is symmetric. We would sanction them for not following nuclear deals as well. Third, due to the agile nature of these militias, they're designed to subsist on little and can cause instability and hold political sway without high levels of funding due to the history of fear they inspired. So in OG's absolute best case scenario, they'll have a marginal short-term impact in funding, but these groups will come back even stronger afterwards because they have a newfound ability to conserve resources, causing even worse long-term impacts. And fourth, these militias are built on strong ideologies. Even this comes down to like attrition tactics because they aren't receiving funds from Iran. Ideologies and a history of fighting for like freedom, whether it's political, religious, etc., these die hard. They're likely to persist, these like fundamental ideologies, and even with this withdrawal of support from Iran, like they're more likely to frame this as, oh, we're being oppressed by our former supporters, we're being wronged, and thus use this to gain even more supporters. These are like people who are very adept at marketing in this region, thus encouraging sympathy or garnering support from anti-Iran state actors. And fifth, side government is just a much higher bar ask than opposition. There are few reasons why they aren't likely to be receptive to such an ask as they would be to denuclearization. One, Iran has showed a willingness to sign nuclear agreements with America in the past, such as the JCPOA Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. There's no such history with armed militia funding, so there's no reason they would agree in the future. Two, the magnitude of the ask is much higher. Asking Iran to defund like 3 entire groups is like much less likely than asking for like a single policy. This is true given the cost benefit analysis that Iran has done that leads them to support these groups. Like, thus, Iran is not the tipping point in the existence or the strength of these groups, and the probability that we can ensure Iran divesting of the organization is slim, making the US ultimately look incompetent. But even if we give Gov their best case scenario and say that Iran cutting off support from these groups will completely eradicate them, like this is highly unlikely. Even if you eradicate these 3 specific groups, removing certain armed militias won't remove the risk of armed militias as a whole. These militias exist due to long-term anger towards systemic poverty, religious oppression, anger towards governments, etc. So insofar as cutting off the snake of the head doesn't destroy the entire snake, American past intervention in the Middle East prove this. For these reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I'd now like to welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition.
I just want to confirm that I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, perfect. Then I will begin. The story that we give you on opening opposition is that in this normative debate, denuclearization is the most important priority and is most likely to succeed when led by America. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to do some rebuttal of OG with some integrated weighing. Second, I'll be extending a bit of our material. And finally, ending on some of the main issues in today's debate. I think first on this question of on rebuttal to OG. There are 2 main issues that OG talks about. First is the likelihood and the success of negotiations, and secondly, what our main priority is. On the success of negotiations, I think there are a few things that we care about here. First is which of these 2 policies is likely to achieve all goals. I think we tell you in LO that denuclearization is just an easier ask. Why is this the case? First of all, it's literally just one policy as opposed to asking for the defunding of 3 separate militia groups. I think that asking for defunding of 3 separate militia groups is just a higher magnitude ask that they're just less likely to comply with, even if they agree to it, but they're not likely to agree with it in the first place. I don't think that OG actually gives you any mechanization with why they would actually even enter this deal in the first place. America would just waste a lot of time and resources trying to manufacture and create and design this deal without anyone actually agreeing to it. But then we also tell you it is easier to monitor because of like drone and monitoring systems, which they can see to our mechanism in their very first speech. I think it is very important to note here that drones in the past, as they stated themselves, have been able to be used to monitor nuclear systems, and especially given the amount of advancement in technology since the last nuclear deal and in the past few years, means that it'll be even easier to monitor and hold them accountable. And if they don't adhere to the asks of the nuclear deal, we can place sanctions on them, do the same sorts of punishment mechanisms that OG tells you about. On the other hand, funding goes through things like banks. Money is not something you can look at through a drone. That just doesn't make sense to say that the monitoring systems are symmetric, because you can't use a drone to look at funding. It is just not possible to do this. But then what is the only link they have left then? The only link they have is that Iran cares about humanitarianism. I don't think this matters a lot insofar as they themselves tell you that they only care about perception of humanitarianism. They're not actually going to change their cost-benefit analysis behind funding just because of this one desire to look humanitarian. They care much more about seeming powerful, as OG themselves tell you, and they seem more powerful when they continue to fund these groups because that impacts their relationships with 3 other countries, actually the entire Middle East, whereas nuclearization, only like their internal citizens care that much about. And nuclearization, like as a whole, isn't something they care about as much in terms of their power internationally internationally. DPM argues that Iran is likely to adhere to a deal due to a desire to be more humanitarian, but given our analysis of Iran's soft power desires, it's unclear whether this mechanism is actually genuine, and I think they also get more hard power on our side of the house. But then they say that Iran wants to seem ahead, which is why they are going to keep their nuclear weapons. First, I think they've shown a historical willingness to at least somewhat cooperate with nuclear deals. This is much better than what has happened on the other side. They've never shown any sort of cooperation in terms of defunding armed militia groups. So I think we're at least somewhat ahead here. But second, I think that nukes don't do as much for them in terms of power, as I already told you. I think that funding these armed militia groups impacts their international power a lot more because it affects how they interact with all of the other countries in the Middle East. But then on the question of likelihood of which is more likely to succeed, they say there's an uncertainty of whether or not they have nuclear weapons. Few responses. First, I think these claims are easily debunked. OG themselves concedes on the fact that we can have monitoring systems and drones. But second, we tell you that drones can't look at funding. They can only look at things that like physically exist, like nuclear weapons. We've been able to find that in the past, and especially given the advancement in technology. DPM argues that there needs to be a bare suspicion to pull out, that Iran is free to covertly and explicitly continue funding. So I don't think they actually get solvency. On the comparative, Iran is able to get away with covert funding, ultimately leading the deal efforts on the government side to be ineffective. I think it also means that they're going to seem weaker on their side of the house, which they won't do, which is why they will never enter this deal in the first place. OG argues that they will lose offensive abilities and thus be effective, but it's unclear why Iran is uniquely the tipping point, as we tell you. I don't think they prove this insofar as we tell you that these groups are made to be able to sustain themselves with a low amount of funding. A lot of militia groups over time have been able to do a lot of really harmful things, i.e. see Rwanda, where these were like individual scale things where the militias or like the individuals didn't have any funding whatsoever, but they were still able to commit an entire genocide. I don't think funding is going to be the tipping point in these armed militias just stopping conflict altogether. They don't prove the link here. But then on the second question of which is the most important priority, a few points of weighing here. First, on the magnitude, we tell you that the magnitude of nuclear conflict is just much larger and is much more likely because of the fact that there's possibilities of miscalculation and miscommunication. But even if none of these really tangible problems don't happen, nuclear accident is always a possibility and has happened in the past and is likely to happen again, which causes a lot of death. Second here, point of weighing, we tell you that the arbitrariness is just much more higher because more civilians die. There's at least some sense of proportionality in armed conflict and limited resources and military engagement, but the same is not true of nuclear conflict. But third here, we say that the timescale, on a timescale weighing, we also win. Armed conflict will always exist to some extent. This is not a way to totally end it. They're not like banning armed conflict or something. But on our side of the house, we not only end nuclearization in Iran, but we also set a precedent to discourage more countries from nuclearization. And we prepare for a total ability to globally denuclearize in sometime in the coming future because we set a precedent of stopping nuclear policy and denuclearization. We also think that the harms from developing nukes themselves are enough to win us the debate because just developing nukes on their own are harmful because of resource mining, etc. And it also encourages other countries to increase their nuclear arsenal. Before I move on, I will take a POI from closing.
Yeah, so Iran's economy has been decimated post-COVID. What makes you think they're actually going to be in a position to develop technology meaningfully enough to be like a risk to the world?
I'm not really sure what you're talking about. Insofar as like the trade-off on either side of the house, they're spending money towards something, right? Like if Iran is able to fund these armed militia groups, and they're also able to start nuclearization, and Iran has showed an intent to nuclearize in the past. So even if it doesn't happen in like the next 2 years, it's likely to happen in the future. I think entering a nuclear deal is super key in order to prevent nuclearization in the future. COVID is temporary. I don't see what the point here is. On our own material, I think we win this round because even in Gov's best case scenario, they don't prove that they're actually going to have any sort of long-term impact because removing certain armed militias won't remove the risk of armed militias as a whole. These militias exist due to long-term anger towards systemic causes, whether it be poverty, etc. And it's unclear why Iran is a tipping point, especially because we give you there are other sources of international, domestic, and grassroots funding that these groups already access and that they can survive even without funding and cause conflict, as we tell you has happened in a lot of places like the Rwandan genocide, both in terms of strong persisting ideologies, incredible mobility to adapt to conditions, etc. I think it's unlikely that they're actually going to succeed in stopping conflict. I think we outweigh on principle the magnitude, timescale, and arbitrariness. Very proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome Member of Government.
Hi, you able to hear me okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Lovely. I think there are two clusters of harms in this debate that probably can be best adjudicated. Our case is going to show you why nuclearization is not the most important threat in the round, especially the nuclearization that's sourced in Iran. Rather, I think the biggest questions are, one, how can we end the threat of militias, which is what the top half that's clashed with? We'll enter and be able to win this clash. But second, we'll introduce a new cluster of harms. Insofar as perhaps the debate is a mess and no one meaningfully is like stopping the militias that are taking place in Yemen, Syria, like the Israel-Palestine conflict, the cluster of harm that CG will be able to meaningfully solve for is providing the type of political tool necessary for the US, who monopolizes the types of sanctions that are being levied against Iran, of sanctions that are crippling their economy, sanctions that are literally ousting people from house and home in the middle of a pandemic that not only makes that pandemic more dangerous, thus resulting in cascading harms of people who are leaving quarantine to go find work, immigrating across borders illegally to go find work so they don't starve during the pandemic, also just results in people meaningfully starving and not being able to support themselves. These are people who are not directly responsible for the nuclearization that their leadership is propagating for them, have no capacity to change it, yet are being abjectly harmed by sanctions that are not ending. So a secondary cluster, a secondary metric for this debate is we can provide a pathway to ending the sanctions that are currently literally killing people in Iran. I think this is a reason why CG should rise to the top. I think then the biggest question that we'll start with is, why are the sanctions going to continue either way? Because challenges that we think that Iran is going to sign the nuclear deal again and that they're going to comply without providing a lot of structural analysis why. I think the only response that we got from OG is they've been demonized by the West, they're not going to want to capitulate. And so let's win this right away. Why is it that the nukes are so inherently important to Iran that they're always going to continue producing them? They're always going to break any deals and or not sign future deals. One, they've reconstructed the national Iranian identity around the idea of Iran being a nuclear power. They've done so through infusing it with cultural battles with other local groups within the Middle East in terms of like antagonism with like the Jewish diaspora in Israel, for example, and they've literally linked how people relate to the state and what they like think about every day of themselves as a person as being a member of a nuclear state. Secondarily, because when in times of strife and economic crisis, people latch onto a sense of security. Nuclearization in their minds provides them that security. So they want it even more and they create a political will that their leadership has to respond to and is motivated to respond to benefit themselves. Thirdly, because the leadership has provided decades of propaganda around this to the extent at which people have grown up their entire lives believing Iran is or should be a nuclear power. And fourth, because they see other nations nuclearizing, and it creates a sense of a grass or green of if they can do it, why can't we? And it makes them turn towards their leadership and create internal pressure for them to nuclearize even more. I think all of which knocks out this idea from OO that Iran is ever going to stop nuclearizing. What that means then is that the sanctions are going to continue either way, unless the US can find another thing to turn to its own domestic populace and say, this is a win for us. This is worth it for us to lift the sanctions. What is that win? That win is getting to Iran to capitulate on military groups. Will the US populace respond by saying, no, we absolutely prioritize Iran nuclearization? Absolutely not. Why? One, because the US can use all the same propaganda techniques that Iran can. Secondly, the average person has no idea what the stage of development of nukes is in Iran, and that makes that propaganda much easier to sell, but also means that people just generally don't care that much about it. It doesn't seem like an immediate and urgent threat. And third, the reason why the domestic populace just doesn't care about this right now is because they are engrossed with COVID that affects their immediate economic and health security. It's not something that they're going to pay a lot of attention to over the other more pressing concerns that they have. However, they will see when the US says, hey, we're lifting sanctions, having that justification of, look, we've gotten Iran to lift the funds that they're sending to the pro-Assad groups in Syria, which are literally using chemical weapons and murdering people. This creates an incentive for the US to not provide a political backlash towards Biden's leadership for having lifted those sanctions. They can give them like a cookie in order to placate the type of backlash, but they won't be able to do it without that cookie. Why is it likely then, and that's the second portion of this debate, that we think Iran is likely to capitulate on this? Why are they likely to agree to this deal? The only thing we got from OG is that they're being vilified by human rights organizations right now. I think my framing for this is one, OO's already pointed out that didn't seem to stop them in the past. So I beg the question too, if they've been vilified for a decade and haven't stopped only until the last couple of years, what has happened recently that has made them more and more interested in changing their national image, changing the global image that they have? Why is it likely that they'll capitulate on a militia agreement now? 4 reasons. The first is because the populace currently has no imagery or understanding of what it is that these militia groups are doing. When you fund a militia group that like ends up supporting someone who uses chemical weapons, there's nothing you can turn back to your populace and show them as a product of the efforts of the funds that you're taking away from them and sending abroad. So the populace is less and less invested in this type of idea. Secondarily, though, in contrast to things like COVID or in contrast to things like nuclearization, which they perceive as a need of immediate security, funding militia groups in Syria doesn't provide that for them. And so with new emergent crises, they have a decreased interest in sending funds over there. They have a decreased political will for that. Thirdly, there has been a spike in the portrayal of like what's happening in Syria, that the populace is more and more exposed to the better the diffusion of technology gets within Iran, the more we see the diffusion of, for example, smartphones that provide them like direct access to the live streaming of what's happening there. That's happened in the last couple of years that have created the backlash against it. And fourthly, because Iran has now diffused and spread its funds across so many different militia groups, finally is in a situation where it has a flexible negotiation tool. We don't think they're going to do equal rollbacks in every single militia group. That's absurd. But what they are willing now to do is say, hey, we will roll back funds on these 3 out of 4 militia groups, like probably not Israel. I don't think anyone in this round is going to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, but other militia groups like Syria or Yemen, yes, particularly because they're not having successes that they can then turn back to their populace and say. So it gives them a flexible negotiation tool versus nuclearization, which is a black and white, either you have a nuclear program or you don't. I think these then are the 4 structural reasons why we think it's likely that, or why they've changed in their like attitudes over the last couple of years that OG fails to provide, but also much more comprehensive and consistent understanding of why they're likely to capitulate and abide by the nuclear weapons program. The last clash in this debate is, even if they would abide, OO says nukes are dangerous and we should hyper prioritize them over rollbacks on militia groups. I have a lot of responses to this. The first is that I don't think it's likely for there to be nuclear conflict in terms of a terrorist group like stealing them. Why? One, because that's literally never happened before beyond the vague reference they made, because terrorist groups don't have the skill of the technicians to be able to operate them, don't have the amount of uranium necessary to operate them, don't know where the covert bases are necessarily, and don't have the codes to operate them, even if they get their hands on the nukes. But the second thing that I would say is I'll flip it. It's easier for terrorists to steal Iran's nukes when Iran is forced to shove them underground and not be able to fortify them adequately. If you allow them to come above ground and fortify them with as much money as they need to, it makes it far more secure. This same analysis flips their their stuff on accidents, because when you allow Iran to make it safer and more above ground, there's less likely that a below ground, underground covert accident happens because they're not able to make like space as wide as they need to, or they're not able to bring in the proper technicians that they need to, or we don't provide them with the money to be able to support that. I think similarly, their only other response here is like we shouldn't focus on militias because they're hard to monitor. I think my easy response to this is weapons have signatures, like the chemical composition of like the explosive in the tip, or the composition of the metals in terms of how the weapons was built allows us to pinpoint forensically exactly where that weapon came from. So I think this like last standing thing from OO is like we would never be able to like track militia, we shouldn't focus on it anyway, falls out of that round. So in conclusion, I think we've comprehensively answered for you why it is that Iran will keep going and the sanctions will happen anyways, why it is that they'll stop with militias, which allows us to both win the militia clash and stopping sanctions on Iran clash, and lastly, why it is that we don't think the nuclearization of Iran is that much of a threat, but allowing them to build above ground would make it even safer.
We thank that speaker for their speech. I now like to welcome member of opposition.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Sounds good. Okay, I'll count you in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I want to be very clear. Neither side in this debate can claim to like extremely broad impacts and changes to the degrees of funding these countries will put into militias, because the geopolitical incentives of countries in the region are extremely complex and can't just be solved by just one policy shifting everything. I do think this is a back half debate because they correctly identified this debate as one existing on the margins about how to marginally help people affected by things like proxy wars and conflict and government negligence, like the Iranian people ravaged by COVID. As such, teams like opening opposition fall out because they overextend their impacts, right? Iran getting nukes is nothing compared to the massive arsenals many countries have. Secondly, it's unlikely to prevent this process altogether. Even if Iran got nukes, those impacts are relatively inconsequential in the broader scope of international relations, since they've given no reason to believe why this tech would be actually employed. You can't credit from them for this specific impact when it comes to protecting lives within the region. On closing opposition, we're going to give you an extension about how you're able to, by virtue of engaging within denuclearization, also get the benefits that you get from closing government that they want to co-opt. First of all, about like in response to opening government. Opening government has a lot of material about Iran nuclearizing anyways and stuff like that. The first response is that this just isn't true. There's a precedent in support of these deals. And they say that no country wants to re-enter into Iranian deal because it seems weak to its people. This might be true in some, like in some instances in the case of like Iran, but this is not true for like the United States. The reason why Donald Trump pulled out hastily and unilaterally, sure, maybe it was to pander like to some degree to his voter base, but notably the U.S. has also pulled out and talking about pulling out of multiple conflicts in the Middle East as of recent that have received terrible reception amongst voters. The reason is because the way that the U.S. acts doesn't primarily focus on voter perception or its people. Rather, the United States takes action because there are specific material interests it tries to fulfill geopolitically and in terms of resources, and they'll do it even if it isn't popular. As such, the United States has a vested stake in Iran not nuclearizing because it directly works against the ability for the United States to exert its influence over that region. It also directly hurts crucial allies that the US has, i.e. Israel, in the event that the Iran becomes a nuclear power. As such, there's a large incentive for the US to pursue this deal, if anything, for their own material interests. But the second is, even if it was true, what matters in international relations is the perception of other nations in relation to the actions taken by Iran, mainly Saudi Arabia. Even if we accept that they developed them in like secret or something like that, what matters is that the perception of denuclearization, even if is something that is not going to remain secret going to the long term, in the worst case scenario, facilitates a couple of things. The first is that this is a massive concession that is perceived to be taking place on the part of Iran. That means at the very worst, it is more likely for Saudi Arabia and other actors in the region to scale back their own funding and support of militia groups against the interests of Iran, which means it's less likely to create this vicious cycle of a pseudo arms race between different regional actors to fund larger and more violent militias. But even in a worst case scenario, we have a notable scale back of violence within that region. This is why violence and proxy wars saw a dramatic increase in the years post scrapping of the Iranian deal in places like Yemen especially, and we'll continue on this in our constructive or extension. The second thing is in our best case scenario, which is that this creates a better entry for diplomatic relations between Iran and other actors within the region. This notably won't make like a huge difference because of the complexities of the conflict panel, but this at least means that it is less likely for actors in the region to discount the possibility of engaging in diplomatic talks to de-escalate conflict at all. Why is this the case? The reason why Iran is pursuing nuclearization is because the United States and Western powers are backing a lot of the Saudi-funded militia groups, and the US has notably funded coups in their country and a primary actor behind the destabilization of the region, and thus Iran's own material interests. As such, nuclearization is the mechanism it has chosen to protect itself. Therefore, the way that nuclearization is perceived has come at the expense of other countries within that region choosing to close off any sort of diplomatic relations with Iran that would discuss possibilities of de-escalation. OD's analysis then, if anything, helps us when they say that Iran will not risk breaking these deals when they are likely to be faced with extremely harsh sanctions. And also this co-op CG's analysis about the destitute conditions of the Iranian political economy, because this means that it is more likely for our specific benefit of entry paths into diplomacy to exist, because it's unlikely that Iran will not work in alignment with the terms of the deal of denuclearization in the first place, right? And this is a good segue into our extension, which is that nuclearization is one of the primary reasons for why they put so much funding behind these militia groups in the first place. And denuclearization allows us to co-opt the benefits that government bench tries to claim, like especially from closing government, about the idea of scaling back the scale of like these militia groups. And this was mentioned at the top of my speech, because to characterize the relations of the Middle East, there are two primary powers that are exerting their influence through proxy wars via their militias in the region: Saudi Arabia and Iran. They have been in constant power struggle, funding militias and proxy wars in places like Yemen, where Iran and like Saudi Arabia are the primary actors behind like backing either side of the conflict. Obviously, there's like nuance; it's more complicated, but this is generally correct in how we understand the power relations within that region. How does then nuclearization do to change the nature of this conflict? Saudi Arabia views nuclearization as a threat to their sovereignty, to their geopolitical influence, especially from Iran, who is on the other side of the conflict. Therefore, when Iran threatens to nuclearize, Saudi Arabia is more likely, like empirically speaking, like this is just true, to escalate and exaggerate conflict further, because the process of trying to nuclearize, especially for aggressive geopolitical reasons that the other party, Iran, is not very willing to negotiate on diplomatic grounds, especially when Saudi Arabia is also a non-nuclear power, right? This means that Saudi Arabia is more likely to pursue proxy wars and conflict with Iran and fund their own militias and groups like Al-Qaeda and like Army of Conquest against Iranian militias to fight in civil wars like Syria, or like what's happening right now in Yemen. This also means that Saudi Arabia is also likely in turn to pursue nuclearization in the event that this threat becomes more and more real. On opening government, they say that they're more likely to make concessions when it's these militias, right? And the only reason that gives it this effect is literally just, well, it's less costly for these interests, for the interests of Iran to like defund militia groups than it is for something as massive as like nuclear programs. programs. Our analysis beats this out because the incentive to fund these militias is decreased in the event that you pursue the policy on our side that has prompted retaliatory measures from Iran in the first place that makes them, by extension, less likely to fund these militias in the first place as well. So what changes now then, and note this engages all of CG's case about minimizing the prevalence of militia groups that I think they correctly identify, is that when you deprioritize denuclearization, this doesn't solve any of the root problems for why they choose to engage in armed conflict in the first place. Because i.e., Iran will still be trying to nuclearize, and as such, the same incentives for prompting them to fund their own militias in response to Saudi aggression, that is, response to Iranian aggression, still continues into a vicious cycle. The only way that you get the benefits of government bench, which is to scale back its funding of like armed militias, is through minimizing incentives for conflict in the first place that employs these militias. The only way that you then do that is to remove the initial incentive in the first place, was that Saudi Arabia does not want Iran to have nukes. And the impact of this is very clear. The people on the ground in Iran suffering from like COVID, like CJ identifies, is more likely to benefit that they talk about. And this is something that exists on our side. But also the high human cost of proxy wars is likely to decrease even if it is marginal. So even if this is like an unsustainable, like long-term project, for example, and taking us at our very worst case scenario, what this means, at least in the meantime, this means that the high human cost of proxy wars is likely to decrease, because even though it is marginal, that extra bit of life saved from the scaling back of like these wars and like the increasing likelihood of like diplomatic talks within countries and the de-escalation of certain conflicts is is something that exists on our side. Gov takes a good stance of decreasing the influence of militia groups. This can only happen when you end one of the primary reasons of this vicious cycle in the first place. The only team that gives you this analysis is Closing Op. Proud to oppose.
We thank that speaker for their speech, and I'd like to welcome Government Whip.
Cool. POI's in the chat. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right out the bat, I want to take CO out of this debate. Their main extension material relates to the perception of denuclearization and the potential for conflict that might ensue. They also attempt to link denuclearization to armed conflicts and why that they will decrease in turn. I have 4 responses to this. The first is to say their entire extension is premised on Iran being more willing to negotiate on this particular aspect. They have not provided any new analysis on this particular point beyond what their opening already said. Secondly, I would just posit that I don't think countries make massive separations between behavior that they view as antagonistic on either side. So yes, Saudi Arabia does not like the fact that Iran is developing nukes. Saudi Arabia also does not like the fact that Iran is funding militias that are fighting militias it is also fighting in some regions. I just do not think countries make a big dissociation between those two things. Either way, you're likely to view those things as antagonistic. The third observation I make is that there is a massive time gap in CO's extension. That is to say that Iran has already gone down the pathway of developing nuclear weapons and technology. Relations are already bad as a result. Saudi Arabia already holds this view. It is unclear to what extent, even if you are able to achieve some scaling back of that from Iran's end, Saudi Arabia will respond positively in turn, given that it has an internalized and ingrained opposition of Iran, and that is immensely popular within Saudi Arabia and those government officials, right? The fourth response I just posit is that there are just broader issues at play. Saudi Arabia and other actors in the Middle East, it's not as if their only concern is just nuclear energy, for example. Like, I actually think that many of these countries, for example, have an ideological and religious motivation for entering into conflicts in other regions. So it is unclear that they just drop this and suddenly give up on the idea of armed conflict simply because they don't view Iran as less antagonistic because of one minute thing, which is denuclearization, which they haven't even proven in the first place. That is CO out of this debate. I want to now move to, though, the likelihood of success, because this is obviously a massive clash in the front half of this debate that I think Josh uniquely clears up through our extension. So let's look at the 2 types of deals on both sides, because the first is nuclear disarmament. Opening government says that they won't come to the table because of past US consistency and they want to elevate their status in the world. I would note that to some extent this is symmetric. There are many ways to elevate your status in the world. Opening opposition says in response, they've come to the table before. I think Josh uniquely breaks this deadlock by explaining incentives that go beyond the immediate political cycle and are not contingent on maybe which way an Iran official views like a particular American politician, for example. And that is primarily because Iran has ingrained a sense of national identity that is particularly linked to the security and strength that nuclear technology as a visible mechanism versus a less visible mechanism around armed militias can provide. And also that there is economic discussions that are linked to this. That is to say that even though the technology that is used for nuclear energy and nuclear weapons is different, those discussions happen in turn. And the idea that Iran has a right to develop energy for its people is a narrative that is propagated. It's extremely popular and one that they believe in. So you're unlikely to break this. Let's now compare that to armed militias, because opening governments say are trending towards more humanitarian views. Opening oppositions say that, they care a lot about this, so they'll do it in secret. I want to note on that particular note about secrecy, this is somewhat symmetric. There are already incentives to arm militias in secret, given that Iran doesn't just care about the US, it obviously cares about its perception amongst European allies, for example, for whom this action is not particularly popular. So if they were going to do that, they'd probably do it anyway. Again, Josh, I think, breaks the deadlock in the front half by providing more structural reasons. That is to say that the populace is less invested in this type of activity because they cannot visualize what that success looks like. And here is the winning framing mechanism in this debate. You do not need to convince Iran to suddenly not fund all of those groups overnight. You can convince Iran to fund the groups for whom it has less of a political, ideological, or religious attachment. The same cannot be true of a nuclear program. You can have a program, or you can't have a program. There's no chunking it up. And the importance of this is that it unlocks a separate benefit in this debate, which closing opposition does not respond to. This is not predicated on you believing we fully solve militias or nuclear technology. And that is the capacity to decrease sanctions in Iran. Note that even though Joe Biden has a more moderate stance of Iran, he is still constrained by the political cycle. Being able to point to a small victory means that they can likely lift sanctions, which has just truly fucked Iran, and especially given the COVID context. People have literally starved to death. This is important because it is a far more certain benefit in this debate and affects a great many millions of people. Would opening opposition like the chance to respond?
You argue national popularity affects policies Iran chooses insofar as most people will never see a nuke, but Iran can use propaganda to make this popular. Isn't this symmetric since Iran can also propagandize its funding for militia groups?
Yeah, but it's a lot easier for a citizen to understand nuclear weapons, our security, versus tying a very complex conflict millions of miles away to their direct security. That is the difference which we explained. So let's compare the two threats now, because opening opposition says security risks and environmental concerns. That's why we care about nuclear technology. I want to note that this is fairly minimal, as their closing also concede the environmental impact is unlikely to be significant. There are many countries with nuclear programs. Opening government only says in response to this harm is long-term. It's kind of strange they don't dispute the very premise of that argument, which Josh does by explaining that there is a huge amount of technology that you actually need to get this to be a level of sufficiency where it is actually a threat, and they're unlikely to develop this sufficiently given COVID. And that is to say that their economy has been decimated. I want to be clear that this is not a contradiction. That is to say they care about developing it and they want to point to narratives about developing it. That does not mean that they structurally have the capacity to develop it. There are also other incentives like mutually assured destruction, which means even if they develop the technology, they'll probably never utilize it such that it will be a threat. I think in contrast, militias are a very obvious threat. Opening opposition's only response is to say that there are other people funding it. Yeah, but Iran is one of the biggest sources of that funding. This is a significant reduction of that, one that is likely to make a meaningful difference. But again, even if you don't buy any of that, we decrease sanctions on Iran structurally. That is a benefit which we uniquely unlock and win the debate as a result.